My glass was raised halfway to my lips when the doors at the back of the reception hall opened and let in a gust of October air and a woman everyone in that room had cried over for 3 years. She had on a pale green dress, not white. She'd never have worn white to my wedding, even faking her own death hadn't made her forget that rule, and she stood there scanning the tables like she was looking for her name card. Nobody screamed. That's the part people don't believe when I tell it later. Nobody screamed, because for about 4 full seconds, every single person in that room, myself included, simply refused to understand what their eyes were showing them. My grandmother was the one who finally said her name out loud, just once, quiet, like she was testing whether the word still worked. Brielle. And it did. I am going to back up, because you deserve to know how we got from a kayak on the Caldwell River to my cousin walking into my wedding wearing the wrong color dress and 3 years of silence on her face. My name is Dana Calloway. I was 32 when this started, and I'd spent the better part of a decade as a certified fraud examiner, which is a fancy way of saying I get paid to find the lies hiding inside other people's numbers. I worked for an insurance consortium out of the Midwest, the kind of job nobody asks about at parties because the honest answer, I read spreadsheets until they confess, doesn't exactly light up a room. I was good at it. I want to say that plainly, without false modesty, because it matters for what comes later. I was good at finding the exact place where a story and a ledger stopped agreeing with each other. Brielle was my cousin on my mother's side, 3 years older than me, the daughter my Aunt Pam had always treated like a finished project and a work in progress at the same time, depending on the room. Growing up, Brielle and I weren't the kind of cousins who saw each other twice a year at holidays and nothing else. We were closer than that. She taught me how to drive stick in an empty church parking lot when I was 16, both of us laughing so hard I stalled the car 4 times in a row. She was the one who sat with me the week I didn't get into the program I wanted in college, not saying much, just sitting, which I came to understand later was its own kind of saying everything. She ran an event planning business out of a converted warehouse space, weddings mostly, a few corporate galas, the kind of work that looks glamorous from the outside and eats you alive from the inside if the margins ever go wrong. And they had gone wrong. I didn't know that yet, not on the day she disappeared. None of us did. She'd gone up to the Caldwell River alone for what she called her reset weekends, a solo kayak trip she took every few months to get away from her husband Connor, who had a way of making every room he stood in feel like it belonged to him first. I remember her telling me once, half joking, that the river was the only place she could hear herself think without somebody asking what she was thinking about. I laughed when she said it. I wish now I'd asked what she meant. She didn't come back. The search ran for 11 days. Volunteers, a dive team, a helicopter for the first 3 days until the budget for that ran out. They found her kayak overturned 8 miles downstream, paddle gone, one shoe caught in a fallen tree. They never found her. I spent those 11 days doing the thing I do, the thing that had always made me useful to my family in moments of crisis, organizing the volunteer schedule, coordinating with the search coordinators, building a spreadsheet of who had searched which stretch of riverbank on which day, because if I couldn't bring her back I could at least make sure nobody's effort got wasted or duplicated. I remember standing at the edge of that river on day 9, watching the dive team's bubbles break the surface over and over with nothing to show for it, and feeling something in my chest go permanently quieter, like a room where someone had just turned off a light I hadn't realized was still on. I remember the funeral mostly in pieces. An empty casket, which somehow felt worse than a full one, because at least with a body there's a period at the end of the sentence. My Aunt Pam standing so still at the front of the church that people kept touching her shoulder just to confirm she was still breathing. Connor giving a eulogy that was, in hindsight, a remarkably tidy piece of writing for a man supposedly destroyed by grief, full of phrases that sounded rehearsed rather than wrung out of him. And my grandmother, Eleanor, 81 years old, refusing to cry. Not because she didn't feel it. Because, she told me later, something in her gut wouldn't let her grieve a girl she didn't fully believe was gone. 3 months after the funeral, the life insurance paid out. It was a substantial policy, the kind business owners take out when they finally start taking their own mortality seriously, And Brielle had taken hers out 2 years earlier after a health scare that turned out to be nothing. Connor and Pam split the payout as co-beneficiaries. Nobody thought much of it. Grief makes people do administrative things to feel less helpless, and closing out a dead woman's business is about as administrative as grief gets. That's where I came in. Pam asked me to help wind down Brielle's company accounts, because I was the one in the family who understood spreadsheets and because, I think, she wanted someone who loved Brielle doing it instead of a stranger from an accounting firm. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I wanted to be useful to my grief the same way everyone else wanted to be useful to theirs. I spent 3 weekends in that warehouse office, going through invoices, vendor contracts, payroll records for the 2 part-time assistants Brielle had employed. It was tedious, sad work, the kind where you keep finding small human evidence of a life, a sticky note with a client's allergy information, a half-finished seating chart for a wedding that never happened, a mug still sitting in the little kitchenette with a ring of dried coffee at the bottom that nobody had ever rinsed out. I found myself, more than once, sitting with an object in my hands for several minutes longer than the task required, just holding it, the way you hold something when the person who last touched it isn't coming back to touch it again. And then, on the 3rd weekend, I found an invoice from a vendor I didn't recognize, dated 4 days before Brielle's accident, for an amount that didn't match anything else in her books. The company name was generic enough to be forgettable, a consulting firm with a website that hadn't been updated since it was built, no staff page, no client list, the kind of digital footprint that exists purely to make a name look real to someone running a quick search and nothing more. The payment had gone out to an account number I didn't recognize either, not Brielle's usual business checking, not anything I could trace back to a vendor she'd ever used before. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't suspicion, not at first. It was confusion, the specific kind that comes from a number not adding up the way it should, the same flicker I'd get at work right before a small irregularity revealed itself to be either nothing, or everything. I sat there with that invoice in my hand for a long time. Outside the warehouse window, the light was doing that low gold thing it does in late afternoon, and I remember thinking, with a kind of dull, distant unease, that grief was supposed to feel sad, not strange. This felt strange. I didn't say anything to anyone that night. I told myself I'd find the explanation in the next batch of records, a vendor name change, a payment Brielle had made for some personal project she never told the family about, anything that would let the discrepancy resolve itself the way most discrepancies do, quietly, with a boring answer at the end. I went home and made dinner and sat across the table from my fiancé Theo, a maritime search and recovery diver who had, in a detail none of us fully processed until much later, been on the original dive team that searched the Caldwell River for Brielle's body. He asked how the work went. I told him it was sad but fine. I didn't mention the invoice. I think some part of me already knew that once I said it out loud, I wouldn't be able to put it back down. I went back the next weekend anyway, because that's who I am, the person who can't leave a number alone once it's stopped making sense. And the deeper I went, the less the explanation looked boring. There were 2 more payments to the same unfamiliar account, smaller, spread out over the prior 6 months, dressed up as consulting fees for a business that had never, as far as I could find, consulted on anything. I cross-referenced the dates against Brielle's calendar, which she'd kept meticulously, every client call and vendor meeting logged with a precision that had always made my job easier when I helped her with year-end taxes. None of the 3 payments lined up with any meeting, any call, any documented business reason at all. They simply appeared, regular as a heartbeat, moving money out of a dying business into an account that didn't belong to anyone I could name. By the time I closed Brielle's laptop that night, I had a feeling I recognized from work, the cold, clean certainty that I was looking at the early edge of something somebody had built carefully enough to survive a casual glance, but not a careful one. I told myself I would bring it to Pam gently. I told myself this was probably nothing, a tax structuring thing, a personal account Brielle hadn't told anyone about because every adult is entitled to a few private corners. I told myself a lot of things that week, the way you do when you can feel a door about to open onto a room you're not ready to stand in. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew, was that the woman whose accounts I was so carefully, lovingly trying to put in order was alive at that exact moment, 3 states away, in a small coastal town, learning how to answer to a different name. I didn't know that the family closing ranks around her memory would, within a year, close ranks against me instead. I didn't know that the invoice in my hand was the first loose thread in a story that would eventually pull my own mother into its center, a woman I had never once doubted, not for a single day of my life, until I had no choice left but to. I only knew, sitting there in that warehouse with the light going gold and then gray, that something in Brielle's books didn't match what I'd been told about Brielle's death. And I knew, even then, even before I understood how far it went, that I wasn't going to be able to leave it alone. My Aunt Pam has a particular kind of stillness she goes to when she feels cornered, a stillness that looks like grace from across a room and looks like a closing door up close. I learned the difference the day I brought her the invoice. I'd rehearsed it in the car the whole drive over, turning the sentence around in my mouth until it sounded careful enough not to wound. Gentle, I told myself. This is your grieving aunt, not a client under audit. I sat across from her at her kitchen table with the printed invoice between us, the same table where I'd eaten 100 Sunday dinners as a kid, and I said I'd found something strange in Brielle's books, probably nothing, but I wanted to ask before I let it go. I watched her read it. I watched her face do the stillness thing, the muscles around her eyes going carefully neutral in a way that, in hindsight, was its own kind of confession. Then she asked me, in a voice gone very quiet and very precise, whether I had nothing better to do with my grief than treat her daughter's death like a crime scene. I told her that wasn't what I meant. She told me she knew exactly what I meant, that I had always needed everything to be a puzzle with an answer, that some things in this world were simply sad and didn't require an investigation, and that if I couldn't sit with sadness without turning it into a case file, that was my limitation, not Brielle's legacy. She said it so smoothly, so reasonably, that for a moment I actually doubted myself, wondered if grief really had warped my judgment the way she described, made me see patterns in noise the way people sometimes see faces in clouds. I left her kitchen with my ears ringing and the distinct, sick feeling of having been handled rather than heard. I told myself I'd let it go. I want to be honest that I tried, for about 2 weeks, to be the niece Pam needed me to be instead of the fraud examiner I actually was. I went to a family barbecue and made small talk about wedding venues. I helped Pam pick out a headstone font for Brielle's empty grave, sitting beside her at a cemetery office with a binder of serif and sans serif samples, swallowing every question that wanted to climb up my throat. It didn't take. Word moves fast and quiet in a family that's decided to protect itself. Within a month, Connor had quietly had me removed as a backup executor on what remained of the estate paperwork, a formality, he said, now that the accounts were closed, nothing personal, delivered over a text message I read 3 times trying to find a warmth in it that wasn't there. Around the same time, my own firm flagged an internal conflict of interest review, because it turned out I'd had brief signing authority on a few of Brielle's vendor transitions near the time of her death, a courtesy Pam had arranged months earlier so I could help close accounts faster. What had been a favor to a grieving family became, on paper, a connection between a fraud examiner and a policy under review by her own employer's parent consortium. I was placed on a temporary internal hold pending clarification. Nobody used the word suspect. Nobody had to. I sat in a conference room with 2 people from compliance who would not quite meet my eyes, a man named Reeves and a woman whose name I genuinely cannot remember, both of them sliding printed timelines across the table at me like evidence in a case I hadn't been told I was the defendant in. I explained, calmly, that I had been doing a favor for my dead cousin's mother, not laundering anything, and that I had in fact been the one to flag the original discrepancy, a fact that should have counted in my favor and seemed, instead, to count against me, as though only a guilty person would be clever enough to point at their own crime first. They told me that was noted. They told me a lot of things were noted. I went home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside, because I did not want Theo to see my face yet, did not want to hand him my fear before I'd figured out what to do with it myself. I'd built my entire professional identity on being the person who finds the lie. I had a wall in my office, actually had it, a small framed certificate from a case 3 years earlier where my testimony had helped recover close to $2 million in fraudulent claims, a case I was proud of in the quiet, unglamorous way you're proud of work nobody outside your field will ever understand the difficulty of. The idea that my own name might end up typed into someone else's fraud file, because I'd trusted my family more than I'd trusted my training, sat in my stomach like a stone I couldn't put down. Theo and I had been planning our wedding for the better part of that year, nothing huge, 120 guests, a venue overlooking the water because we'd met on a search and rescue training exercise where I'd been brought in to consult on a missing persons insurance case and he'd been the diver pulling debris out of a lake. It was not a romantic story by most standards. It became one, slowly, the way real ones do, built out of him bringing me coffee at 6 in the morning briefings and me noticing he was the only person on that team who treated the families of the missing like people instead of paperwork. I remembered, specifically, watching him kneel beside a sobbing mother on a dock and simply hold her hand for 10 full minutes without saying a single unnecessary word, and thinking, that is a man who knows the difference between fixing something and simply being present for it. His parents were lovely, careful people, the kind who had built a small, orderly life and intended to keep it that way, a tidy house with a tidy garden and a tidy understanding of how families were supposed to behave in public. As the scandal around Brielle's account started leaking sideways into family gatherings, I watched their warmth toward me cool by careful degrees. Nothing was ever said outright. It came out instead in the small ways people manage risk, a seating chart quietly adjusted so I wasn't near certain relatives, a comment from his mother about how nice it would be if the wedding could just be about us, dear, without all this other business following us in, said while refilling my water glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Theo defended me every time, fiercely, sitting his own parents down at their kitchen table and telling them plainly that if they couldn't separate me from a scandal I hadn't created, that was their work to do, not mine. I loved him for it, and I also felt, underneath that love, the particular loneliness of being defended rather than simply believed, the difference between someone fighting for you and someone simply already, automatically, on your side. I want to tell you about the night I actually hit bottom, because it wasn't the compliance review and it wasn't Pam's kitchen. It was a Sunday, 3 weeks before the wedding, when my mother called to tell me, gently, that maybe it would be easier on everyone if I didn't bring up Brielle's accounts again, even in passing, even as a joke, because the family had been through enough and people were starting to wonder if I was, her words, still able to separate work from family. She said it the way she said most things, softly, reasonably, the same voice she'd used my whole childhood to talk me out of minor tantrums, and for a moment that old, deep groove in me wanted to simply agree, the way I always had, because agreeing with my mother had always been the fastest route back to peace in our house. That was the sentence that broke something loose in me. Not Pam's anger, which I'd at least understood as grief wearing armor. My mother, asking me to be smaller, to be quieter, to absorb the discomfort of an unanswered question so that everyone around me could keep feeling settled. I had spent my whole life being the dependable one, the one who didn't make waves, the one who got good at reading numbers instead of getting good at being loud, and in that moment I understood, with a clarity that honestly scared me a little, that being dependable had quietly become a synonym for being ignorable. I sat on my kitchen floor after that call, my back against the cabinet, phone still warm in my hand from the conversation, and I let myself feel the whole shape of it. The professional reputation I'd built over a decade now sitting under a cloud because I tried to help. The family that had once called me the smart one now treating my competence like a threat. The wedding I was supposed to be excited about shrinking, in my mind, into one more event I had to manage carefully so I wouldn't upset anyone, one more room where I'd have to perform a smaller version of myself to keep the peace. I cried for a long time, the ugly, unglamorous kind of crying, the kind that makes your throat raw, and somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted. I remember thinking, with a strange flat clarity, that I had spent 2 months trying to be believed by people who had already decided not to believe me, and that maybe the better use of my time was to make belief unnecessary. To stop asking for permission to know what I already knew, and just go find the proof. Theo found me there 20 minutes later, came home from a late shift and saw the light still on in the kitchen and me still on the floor, and he didn't ask me to explain right away. He just sat down next to me on the tile, shoulder against my shoulder, and waited until I was ready to talk, which, in its own quiet way, was the first moment in weeks I'd felt like someone was simply on my side without needing a reason. I didn't know yet how far that decision would take me. I didn't know it would lead me to a postcard with no return address, or a transfer of funds with my own mother's name attached to it, or a woman in pale green walking through my reception doors. I only knew, sitting on that kitchen floor with my makeup ruined and my knees pulled up to my chest, that I was done being the quiet one in a family that had decided quiet meant compliant. I was done absorbing it. I was going to find out exactly what had happened to my cousin, with or without anyone's blessing, and I was going to use the one thing nobody in my family had ever fully understood about me, that the same skill that made me inconvenient to them was the skill that had made me very, very good at my job. I requested formal access to my firm's forensic audit suite on a Tuesday morning, in the same calm, procedural voice I used for every other case file, and the only difference anyone in that office would have noticed was that this time my hands were steady for an entirely different reason. I wasn't investigating a stranger's fraud. I was investigating my own family, and the strange grace of treating it like work was that work was the one language in which I had never once been told to be smaller. The turn for me wasn't a single decision so much as a refusal. I refused to keep absorbing the role of the difficult niece, the suspicious daughter, the woman who couldn't let her grief be simple. I stopped waiting for someone in my family to clear my name, and I started building a case file the way I would for any client, methodically, without apology, label by label, document by document, the way I'd been trained to do since my first year out of school. The first thing I did was trace the Shell vendor account from Brielle's invoices back through 3 layers of registration paperwork, the kind of trail most people give up on after the first wall, a dead-end LLC registered to a registered agent service, then a forwarding address, then nothing at all on the surface. But I knew exactly which doors to knock on because I'd spent a decade learning where families like mine hide things. And I pulled a favor from a former colleague who specialized in shell company tracing to cross-check the registered agent's filings against any personal names on record. It took me 11 days to land on a single physical address tied to the account, a small private mailbox rental at a shipping store 40 minutes from Pam's house. I drove there on a Saturday morning, coffee going cold in the cup holder, and confirmed, with documentation the store manager was willing to provide once I explained I was a licensed fraud examiner conducting a financial review, that the box had been rented under Pam's maiden name for just over 3 years, renewed every 12 months without fail. I sat in my car outside that shipping store for a long time, watching ordinary people walk in and out with packages, completely unaware that I was sitting there with a piece of paper that was about to rearrange my entire understanding of my own family. Pam, who had told me grief made me see crimes that weren't there, had been quietly paying for a private mailbox the entire time she was telling me to stop digging. I understood, in that moment, that I wasn't going to find an easy villain at the end of this. I was going to find a woman who had built her whole performance of grief around protecting something she couldn't say out loud, and that knowledge cost her, the second I had it, the one thing she'd guarded most carefully in front of the family, the image of herself as the composed, dignified mother who had survived the unsurvivable with grace. I had the documentation now. The performance had a hole in it, and I was the only one who could see exactly where. My second move was professional rather than personal. I reached out, carefully, to a contact at the original insurer who had handled Brielle's policy payout, a woman named Carol I'd worked alongside on 2 prior fraud cases years earlier, someone I trusted to handle sensitive information with discretion. I didn't ask her to do anything improper. I simply laid out, with full transparency about my own conflict of interest, the discrepancies I'd found, and asked whether the case might warrant a second look given new financial evidence. Carol didn't owe me anything, but she trusted my work, and she'd always said I had the kind of instincts that didn't go off for nothing. 3 weeks later the consortium quietly reopened the file and froze the remaining undistributed portion of the payout pending review. Connor had been counting on that final disbursement to cover a business loan that had been quietly going sideways since before Brielle disappeared, a fact I confirmed later through public lien filings that showed his name attached to a defaulted equipment loan he'd been servicing with increasingly desperate minimum payments. The freeze cost him exactly the thing he'd been most relying on, certainty, and I watched, over the following weeks, the small cracks of stress start to show in him at family gatherings, a sharper tone, a phone he kept checking, a man who had built his whole composed grieving widower persona on the assumption that the money was simply a matter of time. My third win came from the transaction pattern itself. Once I mapped the timeline of payments to the mailbox account against 3 years of dates, working late into several nights with spreadsheets spread across my kitchen table, I found something that made the air leave my lungs the first time I saw it. The transfers hadn't stopped after Brielle's death. They'd continued, small and irregular, but steady, well past the point where any consulting fee or business wind-down expense could explain them. Someone was actively, continuously funding a person the family had buried. That single pattern shattered the story everyone had agreed to tell themselves, the comforting fiction that this was settled, that asking further questions was an act of disrespect rather than an act of love. It wasn't disrespect. It was the only kind of love I had left to offer her, the kind that refuses to leave a person buried if she might not actually be in the ground. I printed that timeline out and laid it across my dining table, dates running left to right, amounts climbing and falling in a rhythm that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with a careful, deliberate arrangement somebody had built to last. My fourth and most important win didn't come from spreadsheets at all. It came from my grandmother Eleanor, 81 years old, the one person in our family who had never fully grieved Brielle, because some old, stubborn instinct in her had never accepted the story. I went to see her on a Thursday afternoon, sat with her in the small sunroom of her kitchen where she kept her violets, and instead of asking her questions, I simply told her what I'd found, the mailbox, the frozen payout, the continuing transfers. She listened without interrupting, the way she'd always listened to me as a kid, like my words deserved her full attention rather than her patience, her hands still in her lap, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she got up, slow on her hip that had been bothering her since spring, and came back with a small wooden box from her closet shelf, the kind of box that had clearly held something precious for a long time. Inside was a postcard, no return address, postmarked from a coastal town I didn't recognize, with a short handwritten line on the back that meant nothing to anyone except someone who'd grown up hearing Brielle's particular, private way of phrasing things, a small joke between the two of them about a childhood trip to the shore that nobody else in the family would have understood. Eleanor told me it had arrived 8 months after the funeral, slipped into her mailbox with no explanation, and she'd told no one, because she said some truths need to be carried alone until the person carrying them is ready to put them down in front of someone who will actually do something with them. She was ready now. She handed it to me like she was handing me a key, her fingers lingering on mine a moment longer than necessary, like she was passing along not just the postcard but the full weight of 3 years of silent certainty. I held that postcard in both hands and felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for months. Not triumph exactly. Something steadier than that. Direction. I asked Eleanor why she'd never told anyone, not even me, and she said, simply, that she'd been waiting for the one person in this family who would actually follow it all the way to the end instead of letting it go soft and quiet the way everyone else seemed so determined to. She'd been waiting for me specifically. That admission sat with me the whole drive home, the quiet weight of being trusted with something that important, something an 81-year-old woman had carried alone for 3 years rather than hand to the wrong person. I want to tell you what those weeks of investigation cost me beyond the obvious, because the wins weren't free, even when they were righteous. They cost me an easy relationship with my aunt, who I knew would never forgive me for finding the mailbox even if she eventually had to. They cost me afternoons I should have spent picking out flowers or tasting cake, the ordinary, joyful labor of getting married, time I instead spent cross-referencing bank statements at my kitchen table while Theo quietly brought me tea and didn't ask me to stop, setting the mug down beside my laptop and pressing a kiss to the top of my head before going back to whatever he'd been doing, never once making me feel like my obsession was an inconvenience to our wedding plans. They cost me, for a while, the comfortable fiction that my family was simply sad rather than complicated, a fiction I hadn't realized I was still clinging to until I watched it come apart piece by piece under my own careful hands. But they bought me something too. They bought me the return of my own voice in a story that had spent 2 months trying to convince me I didn't have the right to ask questions about my own grief. Every discrepancy I traced, every wall I got through, was a small, quiet refusal to keep being the person who absorbed the family's discomfort so everyone else could stay comfortable. I had spent 32 years being dependable. For the first time, I let myself be relentless instead, and it turned out relentless suited me considerably better than anyone in my family, including myself, had ever expected. I booked a flight to the coastal town on the postcard 2 weeks before my wedding, and I told Theo everything before I left, because whatever I was about to find, I wasn't going to carry it alone the way Eleanor had carried hers for 3 years. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He asked if I wanted him to come. I told him I needed to do this part myself, and he understood that the way he understood most things about me, without needing it explained twice, just nodding and pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than either of us probably intended. I packed a single bag, the postcard tucked into the inside pocket where I could feel its edge against my ribs, and I got on a plane not entirely sure what I was hoping to find at the other end of it. A confession. An explanation. My cousin, alive. I got all three. The town was the kind of place built for people who wanted to be forgotten gently, small enough that everyone knew everyone, far enough from anything familiar that no one would think to look, a string of weathered shingled buildings along a harbor that smelled like salt and diesel and somebody's fryer working overtime. I found the inn from the postmark within a day, a converted sea captain's house with blue shutters and a hand-painted sign out front, the kind of place that photographs well for a website nobody back home would ever stumble across by accident. I stood across the street from it for a long time before I made myself walk in, watching gulls circle over the harbor, rehearsing and discarding a dozen different opening lines. The woman behind the front desk had Brielle's exact posture, the slight forward lean she'd always had when she was concentrating, but her hair was shorter and a different color, and she went by a name that wasn't hers. She looked up at me and the color left her face so completely that for a second I thought she might actually faint behind the counter, her hand flying out to grip the edge of the desk. Neither of us said anything for what felt like a very long time. Then she said my name, quiet, like she'd been rehearsing the possibility of this moment for 3 years and had never quite believed she'd need the line. We sat in the inn's small back kitchen for 4 hours that afternoon, 2 mugs of tea going cold between us, untouched, and she told me everything, in pieces, the way people tell the truth when they'd been holding it so long they've forgotten how to say it in order. The business had been failing for over a year before her disappearance, 2 large weddings had cancelled, a vendor had sued her over a contract dispute, and underneath all of it, quietly, completely, Connor had become someone she was afraid of. Not in ways that left marks anyone could see. In ways that made her smaller every year, controlling the accounts, controlling who she saw, telling her often enough that she was failing that she'd started to believe leaving wasn't an option, only disappearing was. She described, in a flat, careful voice that told me she'd had to learn to talk about it that way to survive talking about it at all, the specific texture of those final months, how he'd started checking her phone, how he'd told her so often she was bad with money that she'd stopped trusting her own judgment about her own business, how the river trips had started as an escape from him and slowly become the only place she could imagine a different life at all. She told me Pam had known from the very beginning. Pam had helped her plan it, in fact, the kayak, the timing, the route on the river with currents strong enough to make a body plausible to lose. They'd planned it over the course of several months, meeting quietly, Pam slipping cash and eventually setting up the mailbox account once Brielle was settled somewhere safe. Pam had agreed to split the insurance payout with her in secret, using the mailbox to funnel Brielle a portion of the money to start over somewhere new, in exchange for Brielle staying gone, fully gone, no contact, for as long as it took for the story to settle into permanent fact. It was, I understood, sitting there, a mother helping her daughter escape one kind of danger by building another kind of lie, one that ended up costing other people, including me, far more than either of them had accounted for. I asked her, gently, if she'd thought about what it would do to the rest of us. She started crying before she could answer, her shoulders folding inward, and when she finally did, she said she'd told herself a story where the family's grief would fade into relief eventually, where the people who loved her would understand, someday, that she'd needed to be dead to certain people in order to be alive to herself. She hadn't accounted for me. She hadn't accounted for the fact that someone in the family would actually look closely enough to find the seams, and she said, through the tears, that some nights she'd lain awake imagining exactly this conversation, dreading it and longing for it in equal measure, because at least it would mean the waiting was finally over. I believed her grief was real. I believed her fear of Connor was real, and as she spoke I felt my anger at her loosen its grip a little, not disappear, but loosen, making room for something more complicated underneath it. I also understood, sitting across that table, that none of that erased what the lie had done to the rest of us, the lost year of real mourning, the suspicion that had nearly cost me my career, the way the whole family had been quietly recruited into protecting a fiction without their consent. Both things were true at once, and I had to sit with that complexity rather than resolve it into something simpler. She was a victim. She was also, in her own way, complicit in a fraud that had reached further than she likely understood, and I told her that plainly, watching her absorb it without flinching away, which told me something about how much she'd already prepared herself to hear it. It was on the flight home, going back through the financial records one more time with fresh eyes now that I had the full shape of the story, that I found the detail that nearly stopped my heart in a window seat at 31,000 feet, the cabin lights dimmed, the man beside me asleep against the window. A single transfer, 8 months after the funeral, routed through Pam's mailbox account and out to a checking account that didn't belong to Brielle at all. It belonged to my mother, Linda Calloway. The amount matched, almost to the dollar, the gap that had appeared in my father's medical bills the same month he'd had emergency bypass surgery, a gap our family had quietly attributed at the time to a payment plan negotiated with the hospital, a story I had never once questioned because it had never occurred to me there was anything to question. I sat with that number for the rest of the flight, unable to make myself open my laptop again, just staring at the small bright rectangle of the screen reflecting back at me in the dark cabin. My mother, who had called me 3 weeks earlier and asked me to stop bringing up Brielle's accounts for everyone's comfort, had known the entire time that Brielle was alive. She had taken a portion of fraudulent insurance money to cover my father's surgery, and she had let me grieve a year of real loss for a cousin who was never gone, because telling me the truth would have meant telling my father the truth too, and some part of her had decided his pride mattered more than my peace. I understood, with a kind of quiet devastation I hadn't expected, that the woman who'd taught me honesty was the most important thing a person could offer another person had chosen silence the one time it would have cost her something to choose differently. I didn't confront her on the phone. Some things deserve to be said to a person's face, in a room where you can watch what the truth does to them when it finally lands. I had 2 weeks left before my wedding, a cousin alive in a small coastal town, an aunt whose mailbox had unraveled her own performance of grief, and a mother who had known the whole truth from the very beginning. I went home and I told Theo everything, all of it, in the order it had come to me, sitting on our couch with the lights low while he listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly at the part about my mother, and he held my hand across the kitchen table afterward and didn't try to make any of it smaller than it was. I also told him I wanted to keep the wedding date. He asked why, given everything, and I told him the truth, that I had spent 3 years letting my family's secrets dictate the shape of my own life, my grief, my reputation, my sense of who I could trust, and I was not going to let them take this one day from me too. If the truth was going to surface, it could surface in a room full of the people it belonged to, and then, finally, we could all stop performing whatever version of normal we'd each been assigned. He nodded slowly, then asked if there was anything he could do, and I told him just to be there, steady, the way he always was, and let whatever happened happen around us instead of to us. I didn't know, sending out the final wedding details that week, that Brielle had been quietly watching the family group chat from a distance for months through an old account no one had thought to block, and that something in the messages about my upcoming wedding, the venue, the date, the photo of me in my dress that my mother had posted with too much pride for someone keeping a secret that large, had finally cracked something loose in her. I didn't know she was already planning to come. I was mid-toast when the doors opened, my glass raised to Theo, words half-formed about how grateful I was that we'd built something honest together in a year that had taught me how rare honest actually is, and then the light from the hallway spilled in around a woman in pale green, and the whole room went still in that particular way a room goes still right before it understands what it's looking at. I want to tell you I handled it with perfect composure. I didn't, not entirely, but I'd had 3 years of practice keeping my hands steady around things that wanted to shake them, and I used every bit of it. I set my glass down, slow and deliberate, the sound of it touching the table the only noise in a room of 120 silent people. I walked toward her instead of waiting for her to come to me, because I had spent the last several months learning that waiting had never once served me. We stood close enough to touch in front of every guest who had at some point, mourned her, and I asked her, quietly, why now, of all nights? She said she'd seen the wedding photos and realized she couldn't let me marry into a new life while still carrying the weight of an old lie she'd helped build. She said she was done being gone, her voice cracking on the last word in a way that told me, more than anything she could have said, exactly how long she'd been holding that decision in. Behind her, I watched my Aunt Pam's face go through every stage of a controlled collapse, her hand pressed flat against her chest as though she could physically hold herself together by force, and beside Pam, my mother stood very still, the same stillness I'd learned to read as a closing door, except this time I already had the key. I didn't make a scene of it, not the kind people might expect from a story like this. I asked the band to take a short break, and I asked my mother to step outside with me, just the two of us, onto the dock behind the venue where the water was dark and calm and entirely unbothered by what was happening on land. The night air was cool against my bare arms, the noise of the reception muffled behind us. I told her what I'd found on that flight home, the transfer, the timing, the bypass surgery. I watched her face confirm everything before her mouth managed to. She didn't try to deny it. She told me, voice breaking in a way I'd never once heard from her in 32 years, that she'd made the choice in a single terrified week, that she couldn't watch your father die because we couldn't afford to save him, and that once the lie was that old, she didn't know how to hand it back to me without breaking something she didn't think could be repaired. I told her it was already broken, the not knowing had broken it months ago, the only question now was whether we were going to try to build something honest in its place. She cried, and I let her, and I didn't rush to comfort her the way I might have a year earlier, because some tears are owed to the person crying them and not to the person standing nearby. We stood there a long while, the dock creaking softly under our weight, and she asked me, finally, if I could ever forgive her. I told her I didn't know yet, and that I thought an honest I don't know was worth more between us than a quick easy yes neither of us would believe. We didn't reach forgiveness that night. We reached something more useful, an agreement to keep talking even when it cost us something, which is, I've come to believe, the only kind of repair that actually holds. Inside, in front of the rest of the family, I did something closer to what people probably expect from a confrontation. I laid the financial trail out plainly for Pam and Connor, not as accusation theater, but as fact after fact after fact, the mailbox, the frozen payout, the continuing transfers, until even the people in that room who had spent 3 years choosing comfortable belief over inconvenient truth couldn't keep choosing it anymore. Connor's face went through anger first, then something closer to calculation, the visible mouth of a man realizing exactly how much trouble he was actually in. I told them what had actually been taken from me wasn't money. It was a year of real mourning spent on someone who was never gone, and the version of myself who might have trusted easily again, the version they'd traded away to protect their own comfort. The consequences that followed weren't instant, but they were real. Connor was eventually charged with insurance fraud, given his deeper financial entanglement with Brielle's accounts and his pattern of controlling her finances, and he forfeited what remained of the payout in restitution, his business loan defaulting publicly not long after. The carefully composed grieving widower persona he'd maintained for 3 years finally collapsing under the weight of records that didn't lie even when people did. Pam's standing in the family didn't collapse all at once so much as quietly erode, relative by relative, as the full story made its way around, and she spent the following year in the slow, humbling work of trying to rebuild trust she'd spent without asking anyone's permission to spend it, showing up at family gatherings with a quieter version of herself, no longer performing composure, simply trying, awkwardly and imperfectly, to be present and accountable instead. My mother and I started seeing a family therapist together, not because either of us believed it would fix things quickly, but because we'd both finally agreed that silence had cost more than honesty ever could. It was slow, halting work, full of sessions where one of us would say something true and the other would need a week to sit with it before responding, but it was real, and real, I'd learned by then, mattered more than fast. Brielle, for her part, got something more complicated than punishment or forgiveness, which felt right, because she'd been both architect and victim of the same lie. I helped her find an attorney who specialized in cases involving coercive control, and she eventually filed for a formal annulment from Connor on grounds that brought his behavior into the legal record at last, the first time her fear of him had ever been written down somewhere official, a small, hard-won piece of vindication after years of being told by his composed public persona that she must have imagined the worst of it. She didn't get to skip the consequences of the fraud, restitution agreements, a long supervised process with the insurer, but she got to walk through it as herself, finally, instead of as a woman hiding under someone else's name in a town full of strangers, and the first time I saw her sign a legal document under her real name again, her hand actually shook with what looked like relief more than fear. My grandmother Eleanor got her own quiet, enormous moment that night, one I think about often. Once the chaos of the confrontation had settled into something calmer, the band started up again, hesitant at first, and Eleanor, 81 years old and stubborn enough to have never fully grieved a girl she didn't believe was dead, danced with both her granddaughters in the same evening for the first time in 3 years. I watched her hold Brielle's face in both hands first, then mine, like she was confirming, with her own fingers, that we were both real and both present and both, finally, allowed to be in the same room without a lie standing between us. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her hand said enough. And then there was Theo. I want to tell you about the part of that night that was just ours, because it's the part one think about most when people ask me how I got through it. After the guests had mostly gone, after Brielle had been quietly taken in by an aunt on the other side of the family for the night, after my mother had hugged me longer and harder than she had in years, Theo found me out on that same dock where I'd talked to my mother hours earlier. He handed me a folded piece of paper, his expression unusually nervous for a man who handled actual emergencies for a living. It was a formal closeout report from his old search and rescue unit, one he'd quietly requested and compiled himself over the past several weeks without telling me, documenting in clean official language that I had never had any involvement in concealing Brielle's whereabouts, fully clearing my name from any lingering shadow the compliance review might have left behind. He told me he wanted me to have it on our wedding night specifically, so that the first official document of our marriage and the first official document clearing me of suspicion could sit in the same drawer together, proof that we were starting this with nothing left unresolved between us. We didn't go back inside for the rest of the reception. We stood on that dock in the cooling October air, my dress not particularly suited for a breeze coming off the water, his jacket eventually settled around my shoulders, and we said the vows we actually meant, quieter than the ones we'd said in front of everyone, specific to the two of us in a way no ceremony script could have written. He told me he'd fallen in love with the version of me that refused to let a lie sit unexamined, and that he hoped I never lost that, even when it made my life harder, because it was the same quality that had made him trust me with the unglamorous parts of his work the first week we met, the same quality that had made him pull that closeout report together quietly, just to give me one less thing to carry into our marriage. I told him that for 3 years I'd been the person who found other people's frauds and missed the one closest to home, and that loving him had been the one thing in that whole stretch of time I never once had to investigate, because it had simply always, plainly, been true. If you're listening to this and wondering whether someone close to you has ever protected another person's secret over your own peace, I want to leave you with the question rather than an easy answer, because I didn't get an easy answer either. The worst betrayal isn't always the one you never saw coming. Sometimes it's the one everyone around you saw coming and quietly chose not to tell you, because telling you would have cost them something they weren't ready to pay. I'm still finding out what else my family decided I didn't need to know. I'll tell you what I find the next time I sit down with this story.